a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Suffragette. Suffragettes were members of women's organizations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries which advocated the extension of the franchise, or the right to vote in public elections, to women. It particularly refers to militants in the United Kingdom such as members of the Women's Social and Political Union. Suffragist is a more general term for members of the suffrage movement, particularly those advocating women's suffrage. The term suffragette is particularly associated with activists in the British WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, who were influenced by Russian methods of protest such as hunger strikes. Although the Isle of Man had enfranchised women who owned property to vote in parliamentary elections in 1881, New Zealand was the first self-governing country to grant all women the right to vote in 1893, when women over the age of 21 were permitted to vote in parliamentary elections. Women in South Australia achieved the same right, and became the first to obtain the right to stand for Parliament in 1895. In the United States, white women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote in the Western Territories of Wyoming from 1869 and in Utah from 1870. But by 1903 women in Britain had still not been enfranchised, and Pankhurst had decided the movement would have to become radical and militant if it was going to be effective. The campaign became increasingly bitter, with property damage and hunger strikes being countered by the authorities with jailing and force feeding, until it was suspended due to the outbreak of war in 1914. Women in Britain over the age of 30, meeting certain property qualifications, were given the right to vote in 1918, and in 1928 suffrage was extended to all women over the age of 21. Opinion amongst historians today is divided as to whether the militant tactics of the suffragettes helped or hindered their cause. Origins. In 1865 John Stuart Mill was elected to Parliament on a platform that included votes for women, and in 1869 he published his essay in favour of equality of the sexes, The Subjection of Women. Also in 1865 a discussion group was formed to promote higher education for women which was named the Kensington Society. Following discussions on the subject of women's suffrage, the Society formed a committee to draft a petition and gather signatures, which Mill agreed to present to Parliament once they had gathered 100 signatures. In October 1866 amateur scientist, Lydia Becker, attended a meeting of the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science held in Manchester and heard one of the organisers of the petition, Barbara Burdicon, read a paper entitled Reasons for the Enfranchisement of Women. Becker was inspired to help gather signatures around Manchester and to join the newly formed Manchester Committee. Mill presented the petition to Parliament in 1866, by which time the supporters had gathered 1,499 signatures, including those of Florence Nightingale, Harriet Martineau, Josephine Butler, and Mary Somerville. In March 1867, Becker wrote an article for the Contemporary Review, in which she said, 2 further petitions were presented to Parliament in May 1867 and Mill also proposed an amendment to the 1867 Reform Act to give women the same political rights as men. But the amendment was treated with derision and defeated by 196 votes to 73. The first public meeting on the subject of women's suffrage in UK was held in Manchester's Free Trade Hall in 1868. One of the speakers was Lydia Becker, supported by Dr. Richard Pankhurst among others. Amongst the audience was the 15-year-old Emmeline Golden, who was to become an ardent campaigner for women's rights and would later marry Dr. Pankhurst and change her name to Emmeline Pankhurst. During the summer of 1880, Lydia Becker visited the Isle of Man to address 5 public meetings on the subject of women's suffrage to audiences mainly composed of women. These speeches instilled in the Manx women a determination to secure the franchise, and on the 31st of January 1881, women on the island who owned property in their own right were given the vote. In Manchester the Women's Suffrage Committee had been formed in 1867 to work with the Independent Labour Party to secure votes for women, but although the local ILP were very supportive, nationally the party were more interested in securing the franchise for working-class men and refused to make women's suffrage a priority. In 1897 the Manchester Women's Suffrage Committee had merged with the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, but Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a member of the original Manchester Committee, and her eldest daughter Christabel had become impatient with the ILP, and on the 10th of October 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst held a meeting at her home in Manchester to form a breakaway group, the Women's Social and Political Union. From the outset, the WSPU was determined to move away from the staid campaign methods of news and instead take more positive action. The term suffragette was first used as a term of derision by the journalist Charles E. Hands in the London Daily Mail to describe activists in the movement for women's suffrage, in particular members of the WSPU. But the women he intended to ridicule embraced the term, saying suffragettes, implying not only that they wanted the vote, but that they intended to get it. The WSPU campaign. At a political meeting in Manchester in 1905, Christabel Pankhurst and millworker Annie Kenney disrupted speeches by prominent Liberals, Winston Churchill and Sir Edward Grey, asking where Churchill and Grey stood with regards to women's political rights. At a time when political meetings were only attended by men and speakers were expected to be given the courtesy of expounding their views without interruption, the audience were outraged, and when the Women Unfold a Votes for Women banner, they were both arrested for a technical assault on a policeman. When Pankhurst and Kenney appeared in court, they both refused to pay the fine imposed, preferring to go to prison in order to gain publicity for their cause. Stung by the stereotypical image of the strong-minded woman in masculine clothes created by newspaper cartoonists, the suffragettes resolved to present a fashionable, feminine image when appearing in public. In 1908, the co-editor of Votes for Women, Emmeline Pankhurst, designed the suffragettes' colour scheme of purple for loyalty and dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. The fashionable London shops, Selfridges and Liberty, sold tricolour striped ribbon for hats, rosettes, badges and belts, as well as coloured garments, underwear, handbags, shoes, slippers and toilet soap. As membership of the WSPU grew, it became fashionable for women to identify with the cause by wearing the colours, often discreetly in a small piece of jewellery or by carrying a heart-shaped vesta case. And in December 1908, the London jewellers, Mappin & Webb, issued a catalogue of suffragette jewellery in time for the Christmas season. Sylvia Pankhurst said at the time, "Many suffragists spend more money on clothes than they can comfortably afford, rather than run the risk of being considered outre and doing harm to the cause." In 1909, the WSPU presented specially commissioned pieces of jewellery to leading suffragettes, Emmeline Pankhurst and Louise Yates. The suffragettes also used other methods to publicise and raise money for the cause, and from 1909, the Pankhurst board game was sold by the WSPU. The name was derived from Pankhurst and the surname of H. Asquith, the Prime Minister at the time, who was largely hated by the movement. The board game was set out in a spiral, and players were required to lead their suffragette figure from their home to Parliament, past the obstacles faced from Prime Minister H. Asquith and the Liberal government. Also in 1909, suffragettes Solomon and McClellan tried an innovative method of potentially obtaining a meeting with Asquith by sending themselves by Royal Mail Courier Post. However, Downing Street was unwilling to accept the parcel. Sophia Duleep Singh, the third daughter of the exiled Maharaja Duleep Singh, had made a trip from her home in London to India in 1903 to see the celebrations for the accession of King Edward VII as Emperor of India, and was shocked by the brutality of life under British rule. On her return to the UK in 1909, Singh became an ardent supporter of the cause, selling suffragette newspapers outside her apartment at Hampton Court Palace, refusing to pay taxes, fighting with police at protests, and attacking the Prime Minister's car. 1912 was a turning point for the suffragettes as they turned to using more militant tactics, chaining themselves to railings, setting fire to post-box contents, smashing windows and occasionally detonating bombs. Some radical techniques used by the suffragettes were learned from Russian exiles from Tsarism who had escaped to England. In 1914, at least 7 churches were bombed or set on fire across the United Kingdom, including Westminster Abbey, where an explosion aimed at destroying the 700-year-old coronation chair only caused minor damage. One suffragette, Emily Davison, died under the King's horse, Anma, at the Derby on the 4th of June 1913. It is debated whether she was trying to pull down the horse, attach a suffragette scarf or banner to it, or commit suicide to become a martyr to the cause. However, recent analysis of the film of the event suggests that she was merely trying to attach a scarf to the horse, and the suicide theory seems unlikely as she was carrying a return train ticket from Epsom and had holiday plans with her sister in the near future. Many suffragettes were imprisoned and refused food as a scare tactic against the government. The Liberal government of the day led by Asquith responded with the Cat and Mouse Act. Imprisonment. In the early 20th century until the First World War, approximately 1,000 suffragettes were imprisoned in Britain. Most early incarcerations were for public order offences and failure to pay outstanding fines. While incarcerated, suffragettes lobbied to be considered political prisoners. With such a designation, suffragettes would be placed in the First Division as opposed to the Second or Third Division of the prison system, and as political prisoners would be granted certain freedoms and liberties not allotted to other prison divisions, such as being allowed frequent visits and being allowed to write books or articles. Because of a lack of consistency between the different courts, suffragettes would not necessarily be placed in the First Division, and could be placed in Second or Third Division, which enjoyed fewer liberties. This cause was taken up by the Women's Social and Political Union, a large organisation in Britain that lobbied for women's suffrage led by militant suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. The WSPU campaigned to get imprisoned suffragettes recognised as political prisoners. However, this campaign was largely unsuccessful, citing a fear that the suffragettes becoming political prisoners would make for easy martyrdom, and with thoughts from the courts and the Home Office that they were abusing the freedoms of First Division to further the agenda of the WSPU, suffragettes were placed in Second Division, and in some cases the Third Division, in prisons with no special privileges granted to them as a result. Arson, property damage and civil disobedience. Throughout the women's suffrage movement, many tactics were employed in order to achieve the goals of the movement. Throughout Britain, the contents of letter boxes were set alight or corrosive acids or liquids poured over the letters and postcards inside, and shop and office windows were smashed with hammers. Telephone wires were cut, and graffiti slogans began appearing on the streets. Places that wealthy people, typically men, frequented were also burnt and destroyed while unattended so that there was no risk to life, including cricket pitches, golf courses and horse racing tracks. Pinfold Manor in Surrey, which was being built for Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, was targeted with 2 bombs on the 19th of February 1913, only one of which exploded, causing significant damage. In her memoirs, Sylvia Pankhurst claimed that Emily Davison carried out the attack. There were 250 arson or destruction attacks in a 6-month period in 1913. Reports exist in the parliamentary papers, which includes lists of the incendiary devices, explosions, artwork destruction, arson attacks, window breaking, post box burning and telegraph cable breaking that occurred during the most militant years from 1910-1914. Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Would you like to know more?